is utilitarianism? First of all, let's just look at some words here. Obviously, the term utilitarianism is built upon the root word utility. What is useful? What has use or in some way is helpful would be the useful. It's pretty much synonymous with pleasure in utilitarianism. That is, the presumption is that whatever gives pleasure, enjoyment, or in some way or another promotes happiness is useful. So that's why it's called utilitarianism. Right? And yes, because utilitarianism basically identifies the good, the point of life, like the good with a capital G, with pleasure, that makes it a form of hedonism. Hedonism is built on the Greek word hedone, which means pleasure. So anyone who says that the point of life is to enjoy yourself, anyone who says that the point of life is to maximize your pleasure and happiness, they're a hedonist. And there's nothing wrong with being a hedonist. It has negative connotations, which are perhaps in some context valid. But in philosophy, it's perfectly respectable theory because it's just the idea that pleasure, widely understood, pleasure, not just physical pleasure, is the point of life, is what we go for in life naturally and what we should go for because it basically means happiness. Okay. So, yeah, there you go. What kind of theory is this? And certainly utilitarianism differs from relativism. Relativism is a broad theory about what morality is, but it does not give you any sort of foundation for moral judgments. In fact, it says that any foundation for moral judgments is kind of hopelessly particular to individual people or individual cultures, etc. Whereas utilitarianism is a normative theory. And by normative theory, a theory that in some way or another tells you what to do. And to do that, it provides a foundation for morality. What does that mean? A theory, it gives you a theory of right and wrong. That is, what is it that makes something right? And what is it, therefore, that makes something wrong? So, any normative theory will give you some standard by which to make moral judgments. And utilitarianism certainly does do that. With the principle of utility or greatest happiness principle, which is essentially the rule, always do that, which maximizes pleasure and happiness and minimizes pain and unhappiness. And one should say, you do this disinterestedly. If I can spell disinterestedly. Right? You want to max the happiness for everyone who has an interest, right? Everybody who's. So just to make that clear, that the rule is not to be selfishly applied, it's to be applied in a disinterested way. So that is the standard by which to make moral judgments. What should I do? That which maximizes happiness and minimizes unhappiness. How do I evaluate somebody's action? Well, did it promote happiness? Then it would tend to be good. Did it promote unhappiness? Then it would tend to be bad. So, on the face of it, that's a way to make a judgment. So, yeah, it's a normative theory insofar as it provides a foundation for morality, which would be a theory of right and wrong, and that would be a standard by which to actually make moral judgments. This is right. This is wrong. This is good. This is bad. So, utilitarianism, it's hard for me to pronounce. It's a tough word. There's a lot of L's and T's and syllables and I's. Look at all the I's in utilitarianism. Just say it 10 times and eventually you'll be able to say it right once in a while. Utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. That is, if you look, all the things in italics are quotes in the books. Utilitarians' concern is how to increase net utility. Right? So if that's what we're trying to do, then clearly it's a form of consequentialism because what we're saying is that the aim of our actions and the moral value of our actions is determined by what comes from them, what results from them. That is, their consequences. So it's a form of consequentialism. So if we look at what this moral theory is actually judging, what you have here, this agent act consequences scheme, is just, let's say, the form of every human action, a moral action or otherwise. You have an agent, you have a doer of the action, and then there's the act that they actually perform, and then there are the consequences of that act, what results from that act. So I'm if I walk to the store and buy a gallon of milk, then I'm the agent. Dan Toohey's the agent. The act is walking to the store and buying milk. And the consequences are you have a gallon of milk in your refrigerator. Right? So any act can be described with this scheme. The reason I point it out is because it's clear that utilitarianism is judging the act, right? Not the agent, not the doer of the act. So when we say this is bad, this is good, this is right, this is wrong, we're not focusing on the doer of the act. We're focusing on the act itself, the doer of the act and their motives and why they did it. Those things may all be relevant in a practical sense or some sense, but in terms of evaluating the act, it's the act itself. That's we concentrate on, and we determine its more value by looking at its consequences. So what we're really, what did I do there? What we're really doing in utilitarianism is judging acts, not people. Yes, the means and ends thing, I take it for granted that we understand that. The author of this particular essay emphasizes this, that to a utilitarian, the ends justify the means. And that is generally true, I guess. That is. The end is the consequences. And if the consequences tend to increase, maximize happiness, minimize unhappiness, then it's a good act. So the means are judged by the ends. So, yeah, the ends justify the means, I guess, in utilitarianism. I thought this was a good quote from the text that actually explained what rule utilitarianism is as opposed to act utilitarianism, which is an important distinction, act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. And also was a nice contrast with Kantian deontology here. From the above description of utilitarianism, it is noticeable that utilitarianism is opposed to deontology, which is a moral theory that says, as moral agents, we have certain duties or obligations. So, like Kantian, categorical imperatives would be an obligation. Never treat a person like a thing. Always treat them as an end in themselves, never as a means. So that would be an example of a deontological duty or obligation, where there are certain rules that you have a duty to follow. And then he continues, said, there is a variant of utilitarianism, namely rule utilitarianism, that provides rules for evaluating utility of actions and inactions. So in rule utilitarianism, we also follow rules like don't kill people or don't steal. But it's the status of those rules that's different than deontology. Right? He says the difference between a utilitarian rule and a deontological rule is that according to rule utilitarians, acting according to a rule is correct because the rule is one that, if widely accepted and followed, will produce the most good. Right? So the rule is justified on consequentialist grounds in rule utilitarianism. Okay, we don't have to think through the consequences of every possible thing that we do. We just follow certain rules, like hold the door for somebody, brush your teeth, don't kill people. These are good rules. They've proven themselves to be good rules to follow in the long run to produce the most happiness and the least amount of unhappiness. So these rules in rule utilitarianism are based on consequentialist grounds. Whereas in deontology, right, according to deontologists, whether the consequences of our actions are positive or negative does not determine their moral rightness or moral wrongness. What determines their rightness or wrongness is whether we act or fail to act in accord with our duty, right? Which is the basis of Kantian deontology. We have a duty. So in deontology, the rules are not based on a consequentialist ground. They're based on what the idea that there's an inner necessity that we simply recognize these rules are binding on us no matter what. Right. Okay. So Right. So, how do you actually apply the greatest happiness principle, the so-called philosophic calculus, which I'll never ask you. That word philosophic is ridiculous. Uh, well, first of all, the quote there above: "While other things appear to be desired, happiness is the only thing that is really desired." That's important for utilitarianism because the idea is that happiness is the only thing that's valuable for its own sake. So it's always valuable. So that claim is really the basis for the greatest happiness principle. But how do you actually apply it? There are problems, right? How do we quantify utility or pleasure? Um, does it really make sense to talk about amounts of pleasure that we weigh up and judge and try to quantify? It's a hard question. What about quality of pleasure? Certainly, John Stuart Mill was in this famous quote about human beings versus pigs and Socrates versus the fool, was trying to justify the idea that there were higher pleasures, that there's a higher pleasure, that the pleasures differ in quality, and that the higher pleasures, the pleasures of the intellect and the imagination, friendship, that these pleasures are intrinsically more pleasurable than the pleasures of the body. But that's another problem. The final objection that the author of the essay entertains is this: the more serious problem, however, remains, which is that utilitarianism seems willing in principle to sacrifice the interests and even perhaps lives of individuals for the sake of the benefit of a larger group. And this seems to conflict with our basic moral intuition that people have a right not to be used in this way, which is basically saying that we think like Kantians, right? Not to be used as a second categorical imperative. I think the utilitarian would say that's because we don't think clearly. Although I think it's a good objection, I think it's one that we would all acknowledge would need to be dealt with. That is that sometimes the right answer, in quotes, right, in utilitarianism seems to be one that tramples on people's rights or lives, and that, like the trolley problem thing, and that just doesn't seem to be right. Certainly, the utilitarian has some response to that, but it does seem to be an important objection.